What if everything modern psychology has uncovered about the human mind was already known centuries ago, not in sleek laboratories, but in candlelit monasteries and dusty libraries? Imagine medieval scholars hunched over parchment, scribbling insights about dreams, emotions, and personality that wouldn't be discovered again until the 20th century. It sounds impossible, yet history holds a startling secret. Long before Freud analyzed the unconscious or Jung explored archetypes, thinkers of the Middle Ages were mapping the mind's hidden depths with uncanny precision. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 23 ancient theories that predicted modern psychology. Theories so advanced they'll make you wonder how much we've really learned in the last 1,000 years. Picture this, a Benedictine monk in the 12th century, dipping his quill into ink as he describes the way memories layer over one another like sediment in a riverbed, a concept shockingly close to modern theories of cognitive encoding. Or a Persian physician in the 10th century detailing how trauma lodges itself in the body, a revelation that wouldn't resurface until the rise of somatic psychology. These weren't lucky guesses, they were systematic observations, painstakingly recorded in manuscripts that gathered dust while the world moved on. But here's the twist, these medieval minds didn't just stumble upon fragments of truth. They built entire frameworks for understanding human nature, frameworks we're only now beginning to appreciate. This isn't just a story about old ideas getting a second glance. It's about rediscovering a lost lineage of thought that connects parchment to textbooks, monasteries to lecture halls. Over the next minutes, we'll decode diagrams that predicted neural networks, unpack philosophical debates that foreshadowed behaviorism, and meet forgotten figures who argued about nature versus nurture a millennium before it became a TED Talk staple. By the time we're done, you'll see the medieval world not as a dark age of superstition, but as a vibrant laboratory of the mind, one that might still have lessons to teach us. So lean in close, the past has been whispering to us all along. It's time we listened. Centuries before personality quizzes flooded the internet, doctors were diagnosing character types with a startlingly different tool, the human body itself. The ancient Greek physician Galen didn't just examine symptoms, he believed your very temperament was written in the fluids coursing through your veins. Picture a medieval healer pressing a finger to your wrist, not just checking your pulse but deciphering your soul. Too much blood, you were sanguine, the life of the feast, quick to laugh and quicker to flirt. Dominated by phlegm, that calm, stoic friend who never loses their temper. Black bile made you the brooding artist, while yellow bile turned you into the argumentative firebrand of the group. What's fascinating isn't just how wrong they were, it's how eerily close they got. Modern science scrapped the humors but kept the core idea: chemistry shapes personality. Swap blood for serotonin, and suddenly Galen's cheerful sanguine type mirrors today's understanding of how this neurotransmitter lifts mood. The melancholic, drowning in black bile, isn't so different from modern depression linked to cortisol imbalances. Even the choleric type, burning with yellow bile, finds a parallel in adrenaline-fueled impulsivity. But here's where medieval thinkers took the theory further than Galen ever did. They didn't just label personalities, they prescribed for them. A melancholic scholar might be told to avoid rainy days and sad poetry, while a hot-tempered knight would cool down with cucumber and rosewater. It was early behavioral therapy wrapped in leeches and herbal tonics, and though we've traded their remedies for antidepressants and cognitive techniques, the goal remains the same: rebalancing the inner workings of the mind. The real surprise, some of their cures weren't entirely off base. medieval doctors urging melancholics to seek sunlight and music stumbled onto light therapy and art healing centuries early. Their belief that diet-altered mood predated modern nutrition psychiatry, even their focus on holistic care, treating mind and body as one, feels startlingly contemporary. So next time you hear someone called phlegmatic or bilious, remember, you're hearing echoes of a 1,000-year-old theory that still lingers in our language, our science, and how we understand ourselves. Long before Freud's couch or Jung's archetypes, medieval scholars lay awake at night deciphering dreams as if they were sacred texts, because to them, that's exactly what they were. Imagine a monk jolting awake at midnight, scrambling to record every detail of a vision where his teeth crumbled to dust. To modern eyes, it might seem like stress manifesting, but to a 13th century mind, this was divine Morse code. The Wanera Critica, a dream manual copied by hand in monasteries across Europe, served as their decoder ring, falling teeth, a grim omen of death, flying. Not just wish fulfillment, but a soul straining toward heaven. These interpretations weren't superstition. They were a sophisticated system, as meticulous as any modern psychoanalyst's notebook. What's astonishing isn't just their belief in dreams as messages, it's how closely their methods mirrored later psychology. Freud famously called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, but medieval thinkers had already mapped that terrain. They just labeled the landmarks differently. Where Freud saw repressed desires, monks saw demonic temptations. Where Jung found universal archetypes, theologians found saints and angels. Even their techniques overlapped. Both eras relied on symbol dictionaries, patient narration, and the conviction that dreams revealed hidden truths. Take the case of a knight dreaming of serpents. A medieval interpreter might call it a warning of Satan's snares, while a modern therapist could frame it as unresolved conflict. Same imagery, different frameworks, but here's where medieval dream theory took a turn modern science wouldn't dare. Dreams weren't just personal, they were communal. A king's nightmare could send court astrologers into a frenzy, dissecting it for clues about coming wars or famines. Visions of the Virgin Mary weren't chalked up to brain chemistry. They were evidence of divine favor, worthy of pilgrimage. This collective dimension hints at something psychology is only now rediscovering: how deeply culture shapes our inner lives. Modern studies confirm that people dream differently based on their beliefs and environment. Just as a medieval peasant's dreams brimmed with harvests and saints, while a CEO's might feature stock crashes and airports. The real twist: some medieval cures for bad dreams wouldn't feel out of place in a wellness blog today. Monks prescribed prayer and meditation to calm troubled minds, practices now backed by studies on mindfulness and sleep hygiene. Herbal sleep aids like valerian root have found their way into modern pharmacies. Even their emphasis on dream journals survives in therapeutic techniques like CBT, where tracking patterns is key. So next time you dismiss a strange dream as random brain static, remember, 1,000 years ago, someone might have staked their life on its meaning. The symbols change, but the human urge to decode them hasn't faded. Now, consider another medieval obsession that feels eerily familiar: the notion of lovesickness. Far from just poetic metaphor, physicians diagnosed it as a physical ailment, complete with symptoms like fever, insomnia, and erratic pulse. Sound like modern attachment anxiety. That's no coincidence. When a troubadour sang of hearts pierced by Cupid's arrow, he was describing what we'd now call dopamine spikes and cortisol crashes. Medieval doctors even prescribed remedies: distraction, cooling foods, or in extreme cases, bloodletting that faintly echo today's strategies for heartbreak. What they called divine madness we call neurochemistry. The song remains the same, only the instruments have changed. The troubadours weren't just spinning pretty tales when they sang of lovesick nights wasting away. They were documenting a medical phenomenon so real, medieval doctors gave it a Latin name, Amah heroes. Picture a nobleman in his chamber, too distracted to eat, his pulse fluttering like a trapped bird whenever his beloved entered the room. To modern eyes, it might look like teenage infatuation, but physicians of the time took it deadly seriously. Their symptom list reads like a textbook case of what psychologists now call limerence, the obsessive, all-consuming phase of romantic attachment. Racing thoughts, loss of appetite, an inability to focus on anything but the object of desire. Sound familiar? Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose medical texts dominated medieval Europe, didn't just diagnose lovesickness, he treated it, his prescription. Distraction, chess, music, even long walks were thought to cool the overheated mind. It's a strategy that wouldn't feel out of place in a modern therapist's office, where cognitive redirection is a cornerstone of managing obsessive thoughts. But here's where medieval medicine took a startling leap. They recognized love as a force powerful enough to rewrite the body's rhythms. When a physician placed his fingers on a patient's wrist and detected an irregular pulse at the mere mention of their beloved's name, he wasn't just observing, he was documenting one of the earliest records of how emotion physically alters physiology. Fast forward to Helen Fisher's groundbreaking fMRI studies on love, and the parallels become undeniable. The dopamine surges, the cortisol spikes, the way romantic obsession hijacks the brain's reward system. Medieval doctors may have framed it as an imbalance of humors, but their clinical descriptions align eerily with modern neurochemistry. Even their remedies hold up in surprising ways. Avicenna's chess prescription mirrors today's behavioral activation therapy, where engaging activities help break cycles of rumination. His warning against melancholic solitude foreshadows research linking isolation to intensified emotional fixation. Then there's green sickness, a mysterious ailment that turned young women pale, lethargic, and lovesick. Today, we'd recognize it as a mix of anemia and psychological distress, but medieval healers saw something deeper, the body and mind speaking the same language. Their treatments, iron-rich foods for the blood, yes, but also sunlight, social engagement, and in a stroke of proto-feminist insight, encouragement to pursue creative outlets. It was psychosomatic medicine in its infancy, centuries before the term existed. What they called the heart's alchemy, we now understand as the gut-brain axis or stress-induced inflammation. The real revelation here isn't just that medieval medicine got a few things right. It's that they viewed love and longing through a lens modern science is only now reclaiming, the inseparable bond between emotional experience and physical health. When a troubadour sang of a heart pierced by love's arrow, he wasn't being metaphorical. To his audience, the pain was as real as a fever, the cure as tangible as herbs or hymns. In an age before neurotransmitters had names, they still knew one undeniable truth: love doesn't just live in the mind, it rewires the body, a lesson we're still unpacking today. The pallor that crept over young women in medieval Europe had a name: green sickness, a haunting diagnosis that blurred the lines between body and soul. Physicians chalked it up to wandering womb vapors, a theory steeped in the sexist beliefs of the time, yet buried within that flawed framework was a radical truth: emotions could manifest as physical decay. Today, we'd pinpoint iron deficiency or clinical depression, but Hildegard von Bingen, the visionary abbess who treated these cases, saw something more. Her remedy, a mix of iron-rich herbs like nettle and verbena, paired with something unexpected: choir singing. To modern ears, it sounds like folklore, but dissect her approach, and you'll find the blueprint for integrative medicine. The herbs addressed anemia, the hymns soothed the mind, centuries before the term psychosomatic entered medical lexicons. She was orchestrating a duet between biochemistry and belief. What's startling isn't just the accuracy of her treatment, it's how her diagnosis of stagnant vapors inadvertently mapped onto modern research, linking emotional suppression to inflammation. When medieval doctors described melancholy as a clogging of the spirits, they were groping toward what we now call the gut-brain axis. The green in green sickness might have been literal, a sallow complexion from poor circulation, but it also symbolized envy, longing, or stifled ambition in a world that offered women few outlets. A noblewoman confined to her chambers, fading into the tapestries, wasn't just iron deficient, she was starved for agency. Hildegard's hymn prescriptions reveal even deeper insight. She didn't just treat the body, she curated experiences. The act of singing in unison, breath synchronized, voices braided, triggered what we'd now identify as oxytocin release, fostering connection and calm. Her herbal tonics, often brewed with saffron, a spice now studied for antidepressant properties, targeted mood alongside hemoglobin. This wasn't mere guesswork, it was observational genius. When a patient's color returned after weeks in the abbey's sunlit garden, was it the iron, the sunlight's vitamin D, or the purpose found in communal labor? The answer, as modern functional medicine affirms, is likely all three. The real tragedy of green sickness isn't its outdated explanations, it's how close medieval healers came to truths we've only recently reclaimed with fMRI scans and cytokine studies. They lacked our tools but grasped the essential paradox: the body keeps score. A modern patient with fibromyalgia or autoimmune flare-ups after trauma might receive a diagnosis of somatic symptom disorder, but strip away the jargon, and it's not so far from those medieval vapors. Both acknowledge that unresolved anguish seeps into muscle and marrow. The difference: Hildegard's toolkit included something many clinics still overlook: the healing power of beauty. A psalm, a stained glass window's glow, the scent of lavender crushed between fingers. These weren't placebos. They were targeted interventions for a soul in distress. Now shift your gaze from the infirmary to the scholar's study, where another medieval innovation was taking shape, one that would revolutionize how we organize knowledge itself. Picture a monk memorizing entire volumes of scripture, not by rote repetition, but by constructing an elaborate mental cathedral. Each stained glass window, each flickering candle in his mind's eye held a verse or concept. This was the memory palace, a mnemonic device so potent modern cognitive scientists still study its mechanics. What medieval minds built as a tool for devotion, neuroscience now confirms as a masterclass in spatial encoding, proof that the best way to retain information isn't to cram it, but to give it a home. Memory palaces weren't just study aids for medieval scholars, they were full-blown cognitive cathedrals, engineered to exploit how the brain naturally remembers spaces better than abstract lists. Picture a young monk named Thomas Aquinas pacing his cloister, mentally placing each line of scripture along an invisible path, a verse by the fountain, another near the rose bushes, a third dangling from the chapel's eaves. What sounds like a quirky habit was actually cutting-edge neuroscience centuries ahead of its time. The technique, borrowed from Cicero's ancient Rhetorica ad Hirnium, recognized something modern labs now confirm. Our hippocampi, those seahorse-shaped brain regions, light up when navigating both real and imagined spaces. Medieval scholars didn't just stumble onto this trick, they refined it into an art form. The Ars Memorativa, a 14th century manual, didn't stop at visual cues. It instructed students to layer in smells, assigning the scent of incense to theological concepts or the tang of herbs to historical dates. Today, we know why that worked. Olfactory cues trigger memories more powerfully than any other sense, a fact trauma therapists use when treating PTSD with scent-based grounding techniques. What's remarkable isn't just the method's effectiveness, but how democratizing it was. Illiterate peasants might have been shut out of book learning, but anyone could build a memory palace. A baker might store the 10 Commandments among his loaves, "Thou shalt not steal," perched next to the rye bread, "Honor thy father," cooling by the window. This mental egalitarianism hints at a truth modern education often overlooks. Brilliance isn't about raw intellect, but about hacking the brain's built-in wiring. When a medieval student visualized the 7 deadly sins as grotesque figures lounging in his dormitory, gluttony spilling wine on the bed, sloth snoring in the corner, he was doing what memory champions do today. The 2004 world memory champion, Clemens Mayer, memorized 1040 digits in half an hour by placing them in a fictional apartment. The tools haven't changed, only the trophies have. But medieval memory arts went even deeper. They didn't just store facts, they weaponized emotion to make those facts stick. A Bible verse about hell wasn't merely placed in the palace's basement. It was paired with imagined screams and the stench of sulfur. The Ars Memorativa urged students to attach shocking or absurd images to dry material, say, picturing Aristotle riding a unicorn to remember a philosophical premise. Modern studies explain why this worked. Emotionally charged or bizarre images activate the amygdala, stamping memories into the brain like wax seals. It's the same principle behind unforgettable advertising or viral content. Medieval educators just lacked the fMRI machines to prove it, the real twist. These techniques weren't confined to academia. Pilgrims used memory palaces to mentally retrace holy sites, embedding spiritual lessons in imagined Jerusalems. Lawyers visualized legal arguments as suits of armor in a castle's armory. Even illiterate cooks mapped recipes onto their kitchen's layout. This was cognitive science in action, disguised as tradition. Today, when medical students use the peg word method to memorize anatomy linking bones to nursery rhyme characters, they're walking the same neural pathways those monks once did. The memory palace isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a testament to how brilliantly medieval minds reverse-engineered cognition without a single textbook. Now, imagine applying this lens to something darker, the medieval practice of exorcism. What if those dramatic rites weren't just about demons, but about trauma relief centuries before PTSD had a name? When priests recited prayers over trembling victims, they might have been stumbling onto exposure therapy. The ritual's repetitive structure, the sensory overload of incense and chanting, even the physical act of casting out evil, all bear eerie similarities to modern trauma treatments that help survivors recontextualize their pain. But that's a story for another chamber in our memory palace. For now, consider this. The next time you struggle to recall a fact, you might owe your solution to a 14th century monk who realized the best way to remember something is to give it a door to knock on. The piercing wail of a 12th century nun speaking in guttural tongues would send villagers crossing themselves not just from fear, but from eerie familiarity. What priests called demonic possession, modern clinicians might recognize as dissociative identity disorder, the mind's desperate attempt to compartmentalize unbearable trauma. Medieval exorcism manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum didn't just catalog symptoms, they documented something profound: the human psyche's ability to fracture into distinct personas, each with its own voice, memories, even physical quirks. When a priest described a demon, shrieking through the mouth of a meek girl. He was unwittingly recording what psychiatry now calls switching between alters. The framework was supernatural, but the observations were startlingly clinical. Consider the case of a medieval anchoress who shifted between three spirits, one pious, one violent, one childlike, each emerging under specific triggers. Her confessor saw demonic forces. Today, we'd identify classic structural dissociation, where trauma splits identity into autonomic survival states. The parallels run deeper. Exorcisms involved meticulous interviews to name each possessing entity, mirroring how therapists today help clients map their dissociative parts. The rituals themselves, repetitive prayers, controlled exposure to triggers, even the physical act of casting out, uncannily resemble modern grounding techniques for PTSD. Neither medieval priests nor contemporary psychologists invented these fractures. They simply labeled what trauma had already carved into the mind. What's revelatory isn't the misdiagnosis, but the shared insight. Extreme stress rewrites the self. The Malleus described alters as demonic masks, while Freud later called them hysterical fugues. Both glimpsed the same truth, that consciousness isn't monolithic. Modern brain scans show how dissociation dampens connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, effectively walling off traumatic memories. Medieval observers lacked fMRI machines, but they noticed the blanks in recollection, the sudden shifts in handwriting or skill clues that hinted at neural partitions. Alchemy's stages offer another unexpected bridge between eras. The Negrito, a blackening symbolizing disintegration, mirrors the therapeutic dismantling of false selves. The Albedo's purification echoes integration work in trauma therapy. Even the final rubedo, where opposites unite, parallels the moment when a fractured patient finally whispers, "All these parts are me." The crucible and the couch, it turns out, shared the same goal, transmuting pain into wholeness. The real tragedy lies in the remedies lost to time. Some medieval cures inadvertently re-traumatized chains and starvation for demons we now recognize as protector parts. But nestled among the brutality were glimmers of proto-therapy, scribes noting how gentle music calmed certain spirits, or how narrative coherence, telling one story start to finish, could temporarily unify fractured minds. These weren't exorcisms, they were early attempts at system regulation, clumsy but intuitive. When a 14th century mystic described her altars as angels locked in battle, she articulated what many trauma survivors still feel, an inner civil war where all combatants wear your face. Now turn to a quieter but equally radical medieval innovation, the confessional as proto-talk therapy. Behind the lattice screen, penitents weren't just listing sins, they were practicing narrative exposure, revisiting painful events in a contained space, guided by a listener trained to spot patterns. The rituals cadence weekly sessions, structured reflection, absolution as cognitive reframing foreshadowed modern therapeutic cadences. What priests framed as repentance, we might now call processing. Both traditions, separated by centuries, recognized the same healing truth: secrets fester, but spoken wounds can breathe. Alchemy's cryptic manuscripts didn't just hide recipes for gold. They encrypted a map of the human psyche, one Carl Jung would spend decades deciphering. Picture a 15th century alchemist hunched over his crucible, staring into bubbling mercury as if it were a scrying mirror. What outsiders saw as primitive chemistry, insiders recognized as something far more radical: soul work. Their Negrito phase, a blackening where substances putrefied, wasn't just chemical decay. It mirrored the crushing weight of depression, that moment when old identities collapse like leaden statues. Modern therapists call it the dark night of the soul. Alchemists documented it centuries earlier with eerie precision. even prescribing their own version of shadow work, stirring the murky depths to confront what lurked beneath. Then came albedo, the whitening, where we might envision therapy's slow climb toward clarity. Alchemists described washing their materials with moon water and virgin's milk. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Purification required both tenderness and rigor, much like unpacking trauma today. A German alchemist's journal from 1482 describes this stage as the soul scrubbed raw, a phrase that could have been lifted from a modern recovery memoir. But the real revelation was rubedo, the crimson dawn of rebirth. When base metal finally gleamed like gold, it wasn't because of any chemical trick. It was the alchemist who had transformed, his patience and perception refined by the process itself. Jung recognized this immediately. The true philosopher's stone wasn't a mineral, it was the integrated self. The Rosarium Philosopherum's illustrations drive the point home with shocking intimacy. One woodcut shows two figures merging into a single androgyne, their union birthing a radiant child. Skip ahead 400 years, and you'll find Jung's sketches of anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine dancing in nearly identical poses. Even the alchemical vessel, sealed tight to contain contradictory elements, finds its echo in Jung's concept of holding tension until a new consciousness emerges. What medieval adepts called the marriage of sun and moon, therapists now frame as integrating conscious and unconscious minds. The crucible was never just a pot. It was the psyche itself, its walls sturdy enough to contain transformation's fire. Now shift from fire to silence specifically, the hushed cloisters where monks practiced Lectio Divina, a meditative reading technique that unwittingly pioneered mindfulness. Benedictine rules mandated hours of wordless contemplation, not as empty stillness, but as active listening to the voice of the heart. Modern apps might package this as guided meditation, but these medieval practitioners went further. They tracked mental distractions with the precision of a lab study, cataloging wandering thoughts as acedia, spiritual apathy, or curiosita's restless curiosity. A 13th century manual from Clairvaux Abbey reads like a cognitive behavioral therapy workbook, teaching monks to observe intrusive thoughts without attachment, a core principle of mindfulness-based stress reduction. The surprise, science now confirms what these monks sensed. MRI scans of long-term meditators show thickened prefrontal cortices and dampened amygdala activity, proof that disciplined silence physically reshapes the brain. When a Carthusian monk described his mind as a lake settling until every pebble below is visible, he wasn't waxing poetic. He was documenting neuroplasticity centuries before the term existed. Even their rituals' breath synchronized to chant, fingers counting prayer beads aligned with modern biofeedback techniques that use rhythm to regulate the nervous system. What medieval practitioners lacked in clinical terms, they made up for in observational brilliance. Take scrupulosity, their term for obsessive guilt over minor sins. Today, we diagnose it as a cousin to OCD, but abbots treated it with something resembling exposure therapy, ordering afflicted monks to purposefully delay confessions until anxiety lessened. Others prescribed manual labor or gardening, intuiting what studies now show. Rhythmic, tactile activity reduces rumination. The monastery wasn't just a spiritual retreat. It was an early laboratory for mental wellness, its stone walls echoing with discoveries we're still validating. So the next time you light a scented candle for your meditation app, remember, you're part of an unbroken lineage. The incense that once cleared a monk's mind for prayer now oils the gears of your relaxation response. The silence they guarded like sacred text has become science's prescription for an overstimulated world. Perhaps the alchemists were right all along. The real gold was never hidden in the earth. but in the quiet alchemy of attention itself. The hushed corridors of medieval monasteries weren't just places of silence, they were laboratories for a radical experiment in mental training. Benedictine monks didn't merely avoid chatter, they weaponized quiet through Lectio Divina, a 4-step meditation that turned scripture reading into a neuroscientific hack. First came the Lectio, slowly whispering a single verse until the words lost meaning. Then meditatio, rolling phrases like stones in the palm to feel their weight. Oratio followed, where the mind dissolved into wordless longing, and finally contemplatio, pure presence, what modern apps package as mindfulness. What monks called prayer without words was, neurologically speaking, a deliberate downshift into alpha wave states, those coveted brain frequencies linked to relaxed alertness. EEG scans of Carmelite nuns in deep prayer reveal patterns indistinguishable from seasoned meditators, proof that medieval cloisters cracked the code of mental stillness centuries before Silicon Valley rebranded it. Then there's the Cloud of Unknowing, a 14th century manual that reads like a medieval headspace tutorial. Its anonymous author instructed seekers to strike down every thought with the sword of longing, not through force, but by surrendering distractions like leaves floating down a stream. Compare this to Jon Kabat-Zinn's foundational mindfulness technique. Observe thoughts as clouds passing in the sky. The similarity isn't coincidence, it's convergent evolution in understanding consciousness. Medieval contemplatives even had their own version of the monkey mind metaphor. They called it Axidy, a restless agitation monks visualized as gnawing rodents in the soul's granary. Their remedy, anchoring attention to breathe or heartbeat, mirroring modern biofeedback practices. Fasting regimens added another layer to this mental alchemy. While today's wellness gurus tout intermittent fasting for cognitive clarity, Benedictine rule mandated strict food windows, 1 meal post-Vespers in winter, nothing until noon in summer. This wasn't just asceticism. Monks reported heightened focus during fasts, a phenomenon modern science explains through ketosis. When the body burns fat for fuel, it produces ketones that cross the blood-brain barrier, sharpening mental acuity. Medieval mystics describing fasting visions might have been experiencing the same clarity biohackers chase with bulletproof coffee, but the real masterstroke was how monasteries structured time itself. Canonical hours, prayers at precise intervals created circadian rhythms long before sleep studies confirmed their importance. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, vespers at dusk. This rhythmic scaffolding trained monks' bodies like a metronome trains a musician. Modern research on ultradian cycles shows our brains naturally focus for 90-minute spans before needing rest. Benedictine schedules, 90-minute prayer blocks followed by manual labor. The monastery wasn't just a spiritual retreat, it was a precision-engineered environment for peak mental performance. Now, watch how these threads converge in grief. When a medieval widow donned black wool for a year and a day, she wasn't just following custom, she was enacting what psychologists now call the container model of mourning. Rituals like lighting candles on anniversaries or keeping a dead spouse's chair empty created what modern grief therapy terms continuing bonds, structured ways to process loss without repression or obsession. Even the medieval year of mourning aligns with current findings on acute grief's natural timeline. What villagers called ghost walks, visiting places the deceased once walked, mirrors exposure therapy techniques used today for complicated bereavement. The candlelight vigils, the laments sung at specific moon phases, these weren't superstitions. They were proto-therapeutic frameworks acknowledging what we've since proven: grief needs time, witness, and ritual to transform. The brilliance of medieval mourning practices lies in their dual focus: communal support paired with personal symbolism. A knight burying his sword with his fallen brother wasn't just performing ceremony, he was externalizing inner rupture through tangible action, much like modern art therapy guides trauma survivors to sculpt or paint their pain. When entire villages joined in keening, a collective wailing that shook the rafters, they were creating what psychologists now call holding environments where sorrow could safely unravel. Even the tradition of telling the beads, reciting prayers on rosaries while touching each bead, anticipated today's somatic therapies that use tactile stimuli to ground overwhelming emotion. Perhaps the most poignant parallel lies in the medieval concept of the grief stone. Mourners carried smooth rocks in their pockets, pressing them when anguish surged, a private, portable anchor centuries before stress balls entered corporate wellness kits. Modern grief counselors might frame this as self-regulation, but medieval peasants needed no jargon. They simply knew some wounds need weight to heal. Those illustrated Ars Moriendi booklets circulating in 15th century Europe weren't just spiritual guides. They were the first known grief therapy workbooks, offering step-by-step scripts for navigating death's emotional labyrinth. Picture a family huddled around a candlelit bed, flipping through woodcut images of a dying man wrestling with temptations, despair, pride, disbelief. Each panel mapped a psychological state we'd now label with clinical terms. When the devil whispers, "No one will remember you," and the angel counters, "Release your fear," they were staging a medieval version of cognitive restructuring, challenging catastrophic thoughts centuries before CBT existed. Parallels to Kubler-Ross's stages aren't just striking, they're methodical. Denial appeared as the temptation of faithlessness, where demons urged the dying to scoff at the afterlife. Bargaining emerged in scenes of desperate vows, "Spare me, and I'll pilgrimage to Rome." Sorrow mirrored the weeping virgin woodcuts, validating grief without condemnation. But medieval death culture added something modern therapy often overlooks: transcendence. Where contemporary models stop at acceptance, Ars Moriendi pushed further, depicting the soul not just resigning to death but actively embracing it as a sacred threshold. The dying were coached to visualize their breath as a golden thread, unraveling from the body toward divine light, a guided imagery exercise worthy of any palliative care team today. Families received equally precise instructions. The vigil of the senses, ritual extinguishing candles one by while reciting, "As this light fades, so must all earthly joys," functioned as exposure therapy, gently acclimating loved ones to loss. Last rites provided narrative closure, with priests prompting the dying to articulate regrets. "I renounce my harsh words to Elias, and blessings. Tell my daughter she carries my love." Modern grief counselors would recognize this as life review therapy, a technique now used in hospices worldwide. Even the physical staging was psychologically astute. Deathbeds faced east toward sunrise, embedding the promise of renewal in the bereaved sensory experience. What's revelatory isn't just the emotional intelligence of these practices, but their democratization. Unlike modern therapies often privatized nature, medieval mourning was communal theater. Neighbors took shifts singing psalms at the deathbed, not just as piety but as distributed grief labor, a concept trauma researchers now call collective holding. The dole bread tradition, where mourners ate loaves marked with crosses, literalized the idiom "to break bread together" as metabolic bonding. Science now confirms what intuition guided then. Shared rituals synchronize heart rates and lower cortisol levels in groups, creating physiological cohesion. Yet Ars Moriendi acknowledged darker truths too. Its Axidy section, depicting a skeletal figure slumped in apathy, diagnosed what we'd now call clinical depression. Medieval observers noticed how grief could curdle into something more insidious. loss of appetite, social withdrawal, even the inability to weep we associate with melancholia. Their remedy, structured productivity. Widows were assigned embroidery projects symbolizing their loss. Monks in mourning transcribed manuscripts with blackened initials. Modern occupational therapy uses nearly identical interventions, channeling emotional stagnation into purposeful motion. This intersection of grief and depression brings us to Axidy, the medieval church's term for what one 14th century monk described as a heaviness in the soul like wet chainmail. Unlike ordinary sadness, Axidy was marked by restless paralysis, pacing cloisters but unable to pray, staring at books but absorbing nothing. Contemporary psychiatry would recognize it as anhedonia, that hallmark of depression where pleasure evaporates from even beloved activities. Monastic manuals tracked its symptoms with eerie precision: disrupted sleep, lying awake as if corpses already, appetite swings, feasting then fasting without cause, and the signature noon demon slump, a post-meridian crash modern doctors link to dysregulated cortisol. The treatments prescribed reveal even deeper insight. Abbots forbade solitary confinement for afflicted monks, intuiting isolation's corrosive effects decades before social neuroscience proved it. Instead, they mandated communal gardening, digging, planting, tending activities now known to boost serotonin and provide somatic grounding. Dietary adjustments mirrored modern nutritional psychiatry. Bone broths for gut health, today's microbiome research. Saffron infusions, a proven antidepressant, and strict sleep hygiene. Even their talking cures had structure. Confession wasn't just spiritual purge but enforced social connection, with priests trained to detect dangerous rumination patterns. What medieval thinkers grasped, and what we're relearning, is that depression isn't a failure of character but a disruption of rhythm. When Hildegard von Bingen prescribed singing until the voice finds its true pitch, she anticipated music therapy's use of vibrational resonance to regulate nervous systems. The monastic herarium's strict cycles of prayer, labor, and rest created what we now call circadian entrainment, stabilizing mood through predictability. Even their darkest insight holds water. Axidy was considered a sin, not because it was chosen, but because surrendering to it risked spiritual death, a blunt but accurate framing of depression's self-perpetuating trap. The real lesson here isn't that medieval people understood depression perfectly, but that they observed it holistically, mapping its terrain across body, mind, and community in ways our fragmented modern systems often miss. When a weeping nun was told to let the tears water the herbs, she received something many patients still crave: permission to let suffering become generative. That fragile alchemy transmuting anguish into meaning remains psychology's oldest and most urgent art. Axidy crept into the cloisters like a thief, stealing not gold but joy itself, a hollowing out of desire so complete, monks described it as the soul's winter. Evagrius Ponticus, that 4th century desert hermit, didn't just name this noon demon, he mapped its tactics with clinical precision. The way it drained color from the Psalms, turned bread to ash in the mouth, made even the thought of rising from one's palate feel like lifting a mountain. Sound familiar? Modern psychiatry would check nearly every box for major depressive disorder, psychomotor retardation, anhedonia, the crushing weight psychiatrists now call psychic pain. Yet Evagrius's diagnosis came bundled with something many contemporary treatments overlook: an ecological understanding of despair. He noticed how Axidy thrived in specific conditions: the stagnant hours when shadows stood shortest, the isolation of a monk's cell, the monotony of unvaried routines. His prescription wasn't prayer alone, but a radical recalibration of the entire sensory diet, sunlit manual labor to reset circadian rhythms, alternating psalms to disrupt rumination loops, even communal meals timed to stave off the midday crash we now link to cortisol dips. The genius of his approach lay in its holistic assault on despair's strongholds. When monks wove baskets in the garden, they weren't just distracting themselves, they were engaging in what behavioral therapists now term opposite action, deliberately countering inertia with motion. The rhythmic chant of psalms created what neuroscience confirms as entrainment, synchronizing breath and heart rate to disrupt anxiety's feedback loops. Even the desert itself functioned as a therapeutic landscape. Its vast emptiness, far from exacerbating melancholy, acted as a negative space that magnified small acts of meaning, much like modern wilderness therapy programs. But here's where medieval thought took an unexpected turn. While we often frame depression as a chemical imbalance to be medicated, desert monks treated Axidy as a misguided search for transcendence, a soul starving not for serotonin, but for sacred awe. Their remedy, the medicine of wonder, a dying monk might be carried to the cliff's edge at dusk to watch falcons ride thermals, another instructed to count the varieties of lichen on a single stone. This wasn't mere distraction, it was precision-guided attention training, redirecting focus from inner torment to the fractal complexities of creation. Modern research on awe walks confirms their instinct. Regular exposure to vastness literally reduces inflammatory markers linked to depression. Now pivot from the desert to the banquet hall, where medieval doctors prescribed an even more surprising cure: laughter. Not the polite chuckles of courtiers, but belly-deep, rib-shaking guffaws. Physicians like Arnold of Villanova wrote treatises on jocotherapy, insisting that mirth could rebalance humors faster than any potion. Their methods would feel at home in a modern positive psychology seminar. Jesters assigned to melancholic nobles, comic plays staged for convalescents, even laughter gardens where the infirm were told absurd fables until tears streamed down their cheeks. The science behind their intuition is now undeniable. A hearty laugh floods the body with endorphins, drops cortisol by nearly half, and most remarkably triggers false alarm signals that teach the nervous system to stand down from high alert. When a 14th century surgeon wired a patient's jaw shut but had clowns perform at the bedside, he was pioneering what pain specialists now call distress inhibition theory. What medieval healers grasped, and what we're relearning, is that depression isn't just a brain state to be corrected, but a whole body ecology to be rewilded. Between Evagrius's desert wisdom and Villanova's comic prescriptions lies a continuum modern therapy often misses. Sometimes the soul needs silence and falcons, other times it demands punchlines and pickle juice. The real breakthrough isn't in choosing one over the other, but in recognizing that our medieval ancestors already had the full toolkit. They just organized it by demons rather than DSM codes. A jester's bells weren't just for show, they were medieval medicine in motion. When Henry de Monville, surgeon to French kings, wrote that laughter could cleanse the spirits better than any purge, he wasn't joking. His casebooks detail nobles recovering from battlefield wounds twice as fast when jesters performed at their bedsides, a phenomenon modern science explains through endorphin release and vasodilation. But the real magic happened in the marketplace, where fools didn't just crack jokes, they staged elaborate social surgeries. Picture a village square where a jester lampooned the local lord's greed, his exaggerated impersonation sending peasants into hysterics while the red-faced nobles squirmed on his dais. This wasn't mere entertainment, it was collective tension released centuries before Freud coined catharsis. The Feast of Fools, that riotous December festival where servants ruled and bishops wore donkey ears, functioned like societal steam valve, a sanctioned space to mock hierarchy so order could resume come January. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales took the therapy further. His Miller's Fart-filled Fabliox and Wife of Bath's raunchy confessions did more than entertain pilgrims. They normalized human frailty through shared laughter. When the group roared at the adulterous carpenter or the greedy pardoner, they weren't just passing time on the road to Canterbury. They were participating in medieval narrative therapy. Modern psychologists recognize this mechanism. Shame dissolves when stories make our private struggles communal. The tale's structure itself was therapeutic. Each storyteller's flaws mirrored in their characters' misadventures, creating a hall of mirrors where listeners could confront their own foibles safely. But medieval humor therapy had sharper edges than modern laughter yoga. Jesters often played the fool to speak dangerous truths, a practice psychologists now call paradoxical intervention. When a court jester mocked King Philip's failed military campaign by leading a toy army into the throne room, his antics allowed advisors to broach strategic changes without losing heads. Today, therapists use similar techniques, prescribing symptom amplification to help OCD patients see their compulsions' absurdity. Even the jester's iconic slapstick, that exaggerated tumble with a loud whack, functioned as early exposure therapy, helping audiences process violence through cartoonish unreality before PTSD had a name. The healing power of medieval mirth extended beyond psychology into pure physiology. Monasteries kept joculator monks to cheer ailing brethren, noting how laughter sped recovery from everything from melancholia to gout. Modern studies confirm their observations. 20 minutes of genuine laughter can increase pain tolerance by over 10%, thanks to endorphin surges that rival morphine's effects. When plague doctors prescribed daily doses of comedy alongside their beaked masks and herb bundles, they stumbled onto psychoneuroimmunology, the science linking positive effect to stronger immune response. Perhaps the most sophisticated laughter therapy hid in plain sight: the gargoyles leering from cathedral gutters. Their grotesque hilarity wasn't random. Architects placed them so worshippers exiting heavy sermons would encounter comic relief, transitioning smoothly from solemnity to lightness. It was mood management through stone, an architectural nod to emotional regulation we've since forgotten. Next time you chuckle at a meme to shake off work stress, remember, you're walking a path medieval jesters paved with bells and bladder sticks, proving some medicines need no prescription, just the courage to laugh at the dark. Now imagine trading the jester's motley for a pilgrim's cloak, as we explore how medieval journeys to sacred sites functioned as proto-exposure therapy. Long before psychologists treated phobias with gradual challenges, pilgrims willingly faced their worst fears, crossing treacherous Alps to prove heights held no power over them, or confronting the open sea en route to Compostela. Each step on those dusty roads wasn't just spiritual devotion, it was systematic desensitization in leather sandals. Cripples dragging themselves toward Canterbury Cathedral weren't just hoping for divine intervention. They were unwittingly pioneering one of psychology's most effective treatments. Every wobbling step on those rutted roads, every blister burst against a walking staff, was a masterclass in graded exposure. Modern therapists treat agoraphobia by gradually increasing time spent outdoors. Medieval pilgrims did it by limping 50 miles through wolf-filled forests. The risks were real: bandits in the thickets, storms in the passes, thieves in the pilgrim hostels, but that was the point. Facing these fears without fleeing rewired their relationship to terror itself. When a mother with a twisted leg forced herself to cross the rotting plank bridge at Rochester, her white-knuckled grip wasn't just endurance, it was behavioral activation, centuries before the term existed. The Camino de Santiago took this further, weaponizing monotony as therapy. Days of identical routines, rise at dawn, walk, sleep in a hayloft, created a rhythm modern researchers recognize as a gateway to flow states. Neuroscientists now study how sustained walking synchronizes brainwaves, easing rumination by entraining the mind to the body's cadence. Pilgrims didn't need EEG caps to prove it. They called it the Rhodes trance, that hypnotic lull where footsteps became prayers and pain dissolved into distance. Some kept walking long after their ailments healed, chasing not miracles but that elusive clarity, what we'd now label as mindfulness-induced neuroplasticity. But the real therapy happened at journey's end. Medieval shrines were littered with votive offerings, tiny wax legs, silver eyes, embroidered hearts, each a tangible trauma narrative. A knight might leave a rusted sword to commemorate surviving a battle's horrors. A merchant's wife would pin up a doll's dress after childbirth nearly claimed her. These weren't just tokens of gratitude, they were proto-journaling exercises, externalizing pain through symbolic objects. Modern art therapists use nearly identical techniques, having survivors mold clay or sketch memories to process what words can't capture. The votive's placement mattered too. Pilgrims tucked them in crevices or hung them high, physically releasing their burdens, much like writing a letter to burn. Some shrines even staged therapeutic spectacles. At Walsingham, pilgrims crawled the Holy Mile on their knees, reenacting humility to purge guilt. Others bathed in sacred springs, their immersion rituals paralleling modern somatic experiencing for PTSD. The genius lay in the dual processing. While the conscious mind focused on penance, the body absorbed the deeper lesson, that survival was possible, that agony could transform into meaning. Today's trauma survivors scaling Machu Picchu or walking fire pits are walking the same path, quite literally. Now, shift from blistered feet to stained glass, where medieval color theory quietly birthed another therapeutic tool. Monks didn't just pick hues for beauty, they prescribed them like medicine. Blue for melancholy minds, its cool tones thought to slake the soul's fever. Green for the restless, echoing nature's calm. Even the jewel-toned robes of saints were chromatic therapy, ruby red to stir vitality in the depressed, gold leaf to focus scattered thoughts. Modern studies confirm their instincts. Blue light lowers blood pressure, green reduces anxiety, and warm tones boost dopamine. When a nun with Axidy was told to embroider with sapphire thread, she wasn't just crafting, she was dosing her psyche with visual Prozac. The Hortus Conclusus, those walled monastery gardens, took this further. Herbs weren't just grown for potions but for pigment, madder root for red, woad for blue, creating a living pharmacy of color. Illuminated manuscripts became literal light therapy, their gold-leafed pages catching candle glow to combat winter depression. Modern art therapists still use medieval palettes without realizing it. Trauma patients drawing with blue pastels to ease nightmares, depressed clients painting sunburst yellows to disrupt negative thought loops. The real magic wasn't in the pigments themselves, but in the act of creation, that alchemical moment when swirling colors on parchment became a mirror for swirling emotions within. What medieval monks understood, and what we're relearning, is that healing isn't a straight path but a spiral. Sometimes it's walked on bleeding knees, sometimes painted in lapis lazuli, but always moving toward the light. The vibrant blues of Chartres Cathedral's stained glass weren't just celestial backdrops, they were precision tools for emotional alchemy. Medieval artisans paid fortunes for lapis lazuli, that radiant stone hauled from Afghan mines, because they knew something modern science now confirms. Certain wavelengths of blue light trigger the release of calming neurochemicals. When sunlight streamed through those sapphire panes, bathing worshippers in ethereal cobalt, it wasn't just pretty, it was biohacking. monks recorded how time spent in the blue glow of the Virgin's robes eased racing thoughts, a phenomenon researchers now link to blue light's ability to suppress cortisol. Even the placement was calculated. Deepest blues filled the apse where penitents knelt longest, their restless minds steadied by the color's quiet power. Red played a different game entirely. While blue whispered, scarlet shouted. Crimson glass, tinted with gold chloride or copper oxides, clustered around martyrdom scenes, Saint Sebastian's arrows dripping ruby, dragons spewing garnet flames. This wasn't just dramatic flair, it was emotional engineering. Medieval physicians noted how reddened light raised pulse rates and sharpened focus, much like modern studies showing red environments enhance alertness by 12%. Tournament knights wore red tunics not just for heraldry, but because the hue triggered opponent aggression, a trick sports psychologists now exploit with locker room paint. Even love spells harnessed red's primal pull. Troubadours wrote verses on vermilion parchment, sensing what we now know, that red ink activates the brain's reward centers like a visual sugar rush. Then there was green, Hildegard von Bingen's color of the living soul. Her herbal manuals prescribed emerald fabrics for manic patients and jade-toned candles for sleepless nuns, claiming the hue cooled the humors like shade under an oak. Modern labs validate her intuition. Green light exposure reduces migraine pain by 40% and accelerates surgical recovery times, but medieval color therapy went beyond passive viewing. Illuminators ground malachite into ink for psalters given to melancholics, knowing the act of tracing verdant letters would engage motor and visual cortexes simultaneously, a dual-action treatment predating occupational therapy by 8 centuries. Gold leaf in manuscripts served a higher purpose than opulence. When a monk's quill traced halos with pulverized gold suspended in egg yolk, he was crafting light traps, tiny mirrors that flickered with every candle's tremble. These dancing reflections weren't just decorative, they created what neurologists call transient attention, constantly resetting focus to prevent rumination. Modern therapists use similar sensory anchoring with anxiety patients, employing glitter jars or shifting light patterns. The Codex Aureus, that breathtaking gospel shimmering with gold, wasn't just a status symbol, it was a medieval SSRI, its radiant pages literally lifting spirits by mimicking sunlight's serotonin boost. Now turn from stained glass to bestiaries, those fantastical animal encyclopedias that doubled as psychological mirrors. When a medieval scribe depicted the pelican pecking its breast to feed chicks with its own blood, he wasn't just illustrating sacrifice, he was externalizing parental guilt. The unicorn, so pure only a virgin could tame it, a mythic metaphor for the era's obsession with chastity's elusive power. Even the lowly hedgehog rolling on grapes to impale them on its spines became a cautionary tale about greed's prickly consequences. These weren't children's stories, they were projective tests in vellum binding, inviting readers to see their own struggles in the beast's allegorical antics. The Physiologus, that 2nd century bestiary fueling medieval imaginations, took this further. Its lynx, whose urine hardened into precious stones, taught lessons about transforming base impulses into virtues. The phoenix's fiery rebirth modeled resilience for plague survivors. Modern psychologists recognize this technique as narrative displacement, allowing traumatic material to be processed at a safe remove. When a knight with battlefield nightmares doodled griffins in his prayer book's margins, he wasn't just passing time, he was sketching his way toward post-traumatic meaning. What's revelatory isn't the accuracy of medieval animal lore, but its therapeutic ingenuity. A bestiary's viper, said to die giving birth unless its mate's sacrifice freed it, became a shared language for mothers fearing childbirth. The art storing grain for winter let anxious peasants discuss scarcity without shame. Even the mythical Bonacon, which sprayed burning dung when threatened, gave permission to laugh at humiliation's sting. These illustrated allegories functioned like a Middle Ages inkblot test, revealing inner landscapes through the beasts people favored, the real lesson hiding in these gilded pages and jewel-toned windows. Medieval thinkers understood what we often forget, that healing isn't just about chemicals or talk. Sometimes it's a blue glow on a stone floor, a golden flicker in vellum, or a fable about a dung-flinging beast that lets us laugh at our own messy humanity. They crafted their therapies to speak to eyes and hands as much as minds, wrapping medicine in beauty so potent it still moves us centuries later. Bestiaries weren't just medieval picture books, they were the DSM of their day, diagnosing human nature through the allegory of beasts. Take the loyal spaniel licking its master's wounds, immortalized in ink as the benchmark of devotion, or the goat, eternally branded as lust incarnate for its restless mating habits. These weren't casual observations, they were early attempts to codify behavior, sorting humanity's messy impulses into animal-shaped drawers. Sound familiar? Evolutionary psychologists still lean on this instinct taxonomy when they describe our lizard brain hijacking rational thought during panic. Just swap medieval woodcuts of basilisks for fMRI scans lighting up the amygdala. The physiologus, that ancient bestiary fueling medieval imaginations, took this further with the unicorn myth. Its claim that only a virgin's lap could tame the wild beast wasn't fantasy, it was behavioral science in allegorical drag. The unicorn symbolized untamed desire. The maiden represented prefrontal control over primal urges. Modern addiction therapy uses nearly identical imagery when guiding patients to sit with the urge until it settles. Even the bestiary's pelican pecking its breast to nourish chicks with its own blood mirrors contemporary attachment theories focus on parental self-sacrifice shaping child development. But here's where medieval thinkers diverged from modern science. Their bestiaries were moral mirrors first, biology lessons second. A hedgehog rolling on grapes to impale them wasn't just a quirky fact, it was a warning against greed's prickly consequences. The ant storing grain taught diligence, the phoenix's fiery rebirth modeled resilience. This wasn't primitive psychology, it was narrative therapy centuries before the term existed. Trauma survivors sketching griffins in manuscript margins weren't doodling, they were externalizing inner conflicts through symbolic displacement, much like art therapists encourage today. Now turn from parchment to pitch as we explore how medieval musica humana predicted modern sound healing. Monks didn't just chant to praise God, they prescribed specific modes like pharmaceutical formulas. The Dorian scale's somatones treated melancholy, while the lively Phrygian mode scattered black bile, according to Hildegard von Bingen's treatises. Modern music therapy confirms their instincts. Certain frequencies reduce cortisol by 20%, and rhythmic chanting synchronizes heart rates across groups, a phenomenon medieval choirmasters exploited to bond communities after plagues. When a nun's Gregorian chant dissolved a nobleman's rage, it wasn't magic, it was sonic neurobiology in plainchant disguise. The genius of musica humana lay in its dual focus, structured intervals for the mind, raw vibration for the body. Psalters instructed singers to place hands on throats to feel healing resonance, foreshadowing modern vibroacoustic therapy for Parkinson's. Bells weren't just timekeepers, their overtones were believed to purify the air during pestilence, a notion less absurd when we consider ultrasonic frequencies disrupting pathogen membranes. Even the harp's gut strings, tuned to mimic the body's ideal humoral balance, anticipated today's binaural beats for anxiety. What monks called soul tuning, neuroscientists now measure as theta wave coherence. So the next time you stream a focus playlist or unwind with white noise, remember, you're walking a path first charted by medieval ears that understood sound's power long before decibels had names. Their musical medicine wasn't metaphor, it was meticulous observation passed down in neumes and Latin chants, waiting 8 centuries for science to catch up. Pythagoras wasn't just spinning poetry when he claimed the universe hummed in celestial harmony. He was laying groundwork for a healing practice that would echo through medieval cloisters. The concept of musica humana, the idea that human bodies literally vibrated at frequencies that could be tuned like lyre strings, wasn't metaphysical fantasy to scholars at Chartres or Bologna. It was cutting-edge medicine. Troubadours strumming lutes for lovesick nobles weren't mere entertainers. They were sonic surgeons, selecting specific melodic modes like a pharmacist compounding tinctures. The Dorian scale's sober intervals cooled fiery tempers, while the lively Phrygian mode was prescribed to scatter black bile from melancholic minds. Modern playlists for anxiety or focus, they're just streaming services catching up to a 1,000-year-old prescription pad. Gregorian chant's power lay in its hypnotic monotony. Those endless, undulating neumes, medieval musical notations resembling little hills and valleys weren't just for piety. They were precision tools for altering consciousness. Monks droning the same pitch for hours didn't just praise God. They triggered theta wave states now associated with deep meditation. The secret wasn't in the melody but the gaps between notes, those micro pauses that synced listeners breathing to a glacial rhythm. Neuroscientists studying trance rituals from Senegal to Siberia have found nearly identical acoustic patterns, proof that medieval choir masters stumbled onto a universal neural hack. Today's binaural beats, with their slightly offset frequencies to entrain brainwaves, are just Gregorian chant with better headphones. Then there were the Cantigas de Santa Maria, those hypnotic Galician Portuguese hymns commissioned by a king who swore they cured his insomnia. Modern sleep researchers would nod in recognition. The Cantiga's repetitive, lullaby-like structure mirrors the tempo and tonal warmth of playlists now used in sleep clinics. But medieval healers took it further, tailoring lyrics to the patient's worries. A knight plagued by battlefield nightmares might be given a cantiga about the virgin shielding warriors. A merchant's wife grieving a stillbirth would hear verses of divine maternal solace. This wasn't just music therapy, it was targeted narrative medicine, wrapping trauma in harmonic metaphor so it could be digested without words, the real stroke of genius. How musica humana acknowledged the body as an instrument. Physicians placed feverish patients near vibrating harp strings, believing resonant frequencies could retune disordered humors. We now know sound waves at certain hertz can literally disrupt microbial membranes, explaining why plague-era cities rang bells ceaselessly. Even the act of singing was medicinal. When choir masters had monks sustain vowel sounds for impossible lengths, they were strengthening diaphragm control, a technique modern speech therapists use for Parkinson's patients. That gravelly Gregorian chant you hear in documentaries, it's not just age on the recordings, it's the vocal equivalent of a monk's calloused prayer knees, built through daily acoustic devotion. Now step from the choir loft to the cloister floor, where another medieval sound therapy hid in plain sight: the labyrinth. Those intricate stone spirals winding through cathedrals like Chartres weren't just decorative puzzles. They were the original walking meditations designed to synchronize breath, footfall, and focus in a single, sacred circuit. Modern mindfulness apps guiding users to walk with intention are rediscovering what robed monks knew instinctively. Sometimes the path to stillness isn't sitting cross-legged, but placing one foot methodically before the other, tracing a pattern older than stained glass. The stone labyrinth embedded in Chartres Cathedral's floor wasn't designed to lose visitors. It was engineered to find something far more precious: presence. Unlike mazes with dead ends designed to confuse, this 11-circuit spiral offered a single, winding path to the center and back, a physical mandala for the feet. Modern neuroscientists studying its effects have uncovered something extraordinary. The rhythmic left-right alternation of following the path activates both brain hemispheres simultaneously, creating a neural bridge between logical and intuitive thinking. Trauma therapists now use similar labyrinth walks to help PTSD patients literally retrace their steps toward safety, rebuilding the hippocampus's spatial mapping abilities damaged by chronic stress. What medieval pilgrims called the path to Jerusalem functioned as full-body cognitive therapy. Each deliberate step became a tactile mantra, the body's movement overriding racing thoughts, much like EMDR therapy's bilateral stimulation. The labyrinth's design exploited proprioception, that inner GPS system telling us where our body is in space, to anchor scattered minds in the present moment. A 14th-century monk's diary describes emerging from the labyrinth feeling washed in clarity, a sensation modern walkers still report. Science explains why. The predictable, repetitive motion induces a flow state, lowering cortisol while boosting alpha brainwaves associated with relaxed focus. The genius of the labyrinth lay in its dual symbolism. The winding path mirrored life's unpredictability, while the guaranteed arrival at the center affirmed ultimate order. Pilgrims whispering prayers with each turn weren't just performing ritual, they were practicing what psychologists now call cognitive reframing. When a merchant grieving lost ships completed the circuit, he wasn't just walking, he was physically embodying the medieval equivalent of "the journey matters more than the destination." Modern CBT worksheets about flexible thinking could take notes from this stone coil curriculum. But labyrinths offered more than metaphorical lessons. They were early biofeedback devices. The slight disorientation from concentric turns created just enough cognitive dissonance to break rumination cycles, similar to how contemporary therapists use mild sensory disruption to interrupt obsessive thoughts. Some cathedrals even embedded hidden acoustics. The right footsteps would trigger harmonic frequencies underfoot, blending vibration therapy with mindful movement. Today's sensory deprivation tanks and walking meditations are high-tech descendants of this low-tech innovation. Now, shift from footsteps to fasting, where medieval monks discovered mental sharpness thrives on emptiness. Benedictine rules mandated strict food windows: one meal afternoon in winter, none until evening in summer, creating involuntary intermittent fasting cycles. Modern studies on these exact patterns show remarkable cognitive benefits. Ketone production from fat metabolism fuels the brain more efficiently than glucose, while autophagy, the body's cellular cleanup process, peaks around the 14th hour without food. Monks describing fasting visions weren't hallucinating from starvation. They were likely experiencing the heightened focus and visual clarity now documented in fasting athletes and meditators. The medieval approach to fasting went beyond hunger management. It was mood regulation through metabolic alchemy. Hildegard von Bingen prescribed bone broths during fasts, intuitively supporting gut health centuries before microbiome research linked intestinal flora to serotonin production. Even their fasting beers, low-alcohol, nutrient-rich brews contained B vitamins now known to stabilize mood during carbohydrate restriction. This wasn't deprivation for piety's sake. It was a sophisticated understanding of how controlled scarcity could reboot both body and mind. Perhaps most striking was the monastic practice of dry fasting, no food or water from sunrise to sunset during penitential seasons. While extreme by modern standards, recent studies on controlled dehydration fasting show temporary fluid restriction can increase BDNF brain-derived neurotrophic factor, essentially fertilizing neural growth. When Desert Fathers spoke of fasting sharpening the soul's sight, they may have been describing neurogenesis in mystical terms. Modern biohackers popping nootropics for cognitive edge might consider this sometimes the oldest tools cut deepest. The real lesson of these medieval practices isn't in replicating their extremes, but in recognizing their core insight. The mind doesn't exist in a vacuum. Whether walking a labyrinth sacred geometry or timing meals to circadian rhythms, they treated cognition as a full-body symphony long before neuroscience had the instruments to hear it.